They say ancient Rome was all grand statues and fancy togas, but no one talks about what went on after dark. Hidden behind stone doors, the nightlife was nothing like we've been told. Why were Roman pleasure houses so common, yet so secret? And what really happened inside? Once you hear it, you won't see Rome the same way again. But to understand what went on behind those doors, you have to start with where they were, and why Rome let them thrive right out in the open. The Suburra district wasn't some romantic backdrop with togas and philosophical debates. It was Rome's grittiest neighborhood, packed with taverns, gambling dens, and street vendors hawking everything from rotting fish to stolen jewelry. And right in the thick of this chaos, brothels everywhere. The Romans basically invented the concept of hiding in plain sight, except they weren't hiding anything. Here's what might shock you most. These places were completely legal, not just tolerated, legally licensed, government approved, and heavily taxed. The Roman Empire was running a protection racket on human misery, because nothing says moral civilization quite like turning human exploitation into a government revenue stream. Makes sense, right? If people are going to do something anyway, might as well make the state rich from it. The brothels weren't tucked away in dark alleys either. Many were strategically located right next to public latrines and busy markets, because nothing says romantic evening quite like the smell of public toilets and rotting vegetables. The logic was brutally simple. More foot traffic meant more customers. But how did customers know what they were looking at? The signs outside used explicit symbols and provocative graffiti to advertise services. Walls displayed fertility symbols pointing directly to the entrance. Ancient Rome's GPS navigation system was apparently powered by explicit carvings. The street-level brothels were called lupanaria, from lupa meaning she-wolf. Business hours started in the late afternoon and ran well into the night. The availability system was elegantly simple. Lamps outside doors indicated whether rooms were occupied. But who exactly was profiting from this human marketplace? The reality was far uglier than any romanticized notion of entrepreneurship. Brothel owners weren't necessarily seedy criminals. Many were respectable male Roman citizens, freedmen, or wealthy women who saw human suffering as a sound investment opportunity. Nothing says, "I've made it in Roman society," quite like owning a portfolio of other people's bodies. Some brothel keepers were former workers themselves who had clawed their way up from victim to victimizer. The ultimate corporate ladder climb from product to management. The day-to-day operations fell to managers called leno for men or lena for women. These people handled the dirty work while owners counted profits from a comfortable distance. Think middle management, except their job description included organize human degradation as a core responsibility. Running a brothel required registering with Roman authorities. This wasn't optional paperwork. It was mandatory government oversight of this brutal trade. The workers themselves were officially classified as infames, disreputable people who had permanently lost basic civil rights. Once stamped with this label, you couldn't marry a Roman citizen, hold public office, or participate in religious ceremonies. It was Rome's way of ensuring that once you were in the system, you stayed there, like a really twisted loyalty program with no exit clause. Brothel owners paid specific taxes called vectigul ex capturis. These generated significant revenue that the government used for public projects. Anyone telling you Rome was built on honor and virtue hasn't seen the tax records. Price control was absolute. Owners set all rates while workers had zero say in their earnings. Customers didn't even pay workers directly. They handed money to managers. But what was daily existence actually like for the people trapped at the bottom of this machine? Forget what you think you know about ancient Roman courtesans from HBO dramas. The brutal truth was that most were enslaved or trafficked into the trade against their will. Others were technically free but crushed by poverty or debt into selling their bodies. When your choice is starvation or forced servitude, calling it a career choice is like calling a mugging a business transaction. Most workers lived in or next to the brothels where they worked. Privacy didn't exist. Rooms were shared or rotated among multiple workers, meaning you never had a space to call your own. Rome's version of efficient space management, human dignity sold separately. Their days started with cleaning, preparing, and waiting for the next customer. The work was physically and emotionally devastating, but there were no sick days, no vacation time, no workers' compensation. Some were branded or tattooed to mark which owner they belonged to, because apparently Roman employee ID badges involved permanent bodily mutilation. Names became another tool of control. Most workers used aliases like Fortuna or Chloe, single names that stripped away their real identities and transformed them into branded products. The Romans understood that erasing someone's name was the first step in erasing their humanity. Corporate rebranding taken to its most evil extreme. The food situation was deliberately minimal. Workers typically received bread, olives, and heavily watered wine. That's it. Personal hygiene was basic at best. Workers used cheap perfumes and oils to mask body odor since regular bathing wasn't guaranteed. One can only imagine the psychological toll of living in constant fear, uncertainty, and degradation. A few managed to save tiny amounts over years or decades. Some eventually purchased their freedom, but this could take most of their adult lives. But where exactly did all this human suffering take place? Before we dive into the truly horrific physical conditions, quick question. Are you as shocked by this brutal reality as I am? If you're ready to keep uncovering the disturbing truths they don't teach in history class, smash that like button and subscribe for more unvarnished historical facts. Trust me, we're just getting to the really disturbing part. The rooms where this nightmare played out were called celli, and they were absolutely tiny. We're talking spaces smaller than modern prison cells with no windows, no natural light, and no ventilation. Basically, Rome's version of sensory deprivation chambers, except people paid money to get locked inside voluntarily. Each room contained a stone or wood platform that passed for a bed. These platforms were covered with straw or animal skin mats that were crawling with vermin and never cleaned between uses. The thread count was apparently whatever the rats didn't eat. Privacy was non-existent by design. Many rooms had no doors, just curtains hanging across entrances. Sound insulation was unknown, so every noise from neighboring rooms was unavoidable. Rome's approach to intimacy was about as subtle as a gladiator fight. The walls were covered with explicit frescoes showing specific acts. These weren't artistic masterpieces. They were crude visual menus that customers used to order the services offered. Ancient Rome's version of fast food picture menus, except infinitely more disturbing. Let's be clear about the sanitation situation. There wasn't any. Floors were rarely cleaned between clients, creating layers of filth that accumulated throughout each day. Lighting came from oil lamps, producing thick, choking smoke that hung in the stagnant air. The smell was overwhelming and inescapable. No ventilation, multiple people using the same cramped space, no proper cleaning, and absolutely no drainage systems. Human waste was simply dumped in nearby alleys, which meant the entire district reeked of sewage and decay. Anyone telling you these places had any dignity or comfort hasn't seen the archaeological evidence. But who exactly was paying to visit these chambers of despair? The customer base was disturbingly diverse and completely shameless about it. Male Roman citizens of all social classes were legally allowed to visit brothels, and they took full advantage. Soldiers on leave, merchants conducting business, craftsmen after work, farmers visiting the city. Basically, any man with coins in his pocket felt entitled to purchase human bodies. It was ancient Rome's version of equal opportunity exploitation. Everyone was welcome as long as they could pay the cover charge. These weren't just society's outcasts and degenerates either. Respected members of the community regularly rubbed shoulders with day laborers and drifters in brothel waiting areas. Finally, true Roman equality, achieved through collective moral bankruptcy and shared depravity. Wealthy clients often demanded exclusivity and private access to specific workers. They paid premium prices to avoid crowds and receive what passed for VIP treatment. Some customers became regulars who developed twisted loyalty relationships with particular workers. punch cards for human trafficking, collect 10 visits, and get the 11th act of exploitation absolutely free. Payment was made using small coins or special tokens called spin-tree. These bronze discs featured explicit images and numbers, functioning as ancient Rome's version of gift cards for the services offered. Because apparently regular money wasn't degrading enough, they needed special commemorative currency with artistic flourishes. Here's what's truly shocking. Married men faced absolutely zero legal consequences for visiting brothels. Roman law and society completely accepted this behavior as normal male privilege. Wives had no legal recourse and no protection from their husband's behavior. Customers often used wall frescoes as ordering catalogs, pointing to specific depicted acts they wanted to purchase. Different brothels served different economic tiers. Cheap establishments offered basic services in horrific conditions for poor customers, while elite brothels provided luxury accommodations for wealthy clients. But what about the inevitable health consequences of this biological nightmare? The medical situation in Roman brothels was a constant catastrophe. These establishments had zero sanitation standards or professional medical care. Workers routinely suffered from lice, fleas, and skin infections that spread rapidly through cramped, filthy conditions. The Romans, who gave us advanced engineering and military tactics, apparently couldn't figure out that basic hygiene might be important in places where bodies regularly made contact. Contagious diseases were rampant and completely misunderstood. Romans had no concept of germs, contagion, or effective treatment. They were essentially playing medical Russian roulette every single day, except the house always won. Ancient Rome's approach to health was basically hoping for the best while expecting the absolute worst, like gambling with their health and well-being. Let's be clear about protective measures. They didn't exist. No protection, no birth control, no concept of safe practices. Romans used folk remedies like olive oil, garlic, and vinegar, which were about as effective as praying to Jupiter for protection while standing in a lightning storm. Some workers used sponges soaked in wine or herbs for internal cleaning, but these home remedies often caused more damage than the problems they were supposed to solve. Roman medical care, where the cure was frequently worse than the disease, and the disease was already pretty terrible. Doctors occasionally visited high-end brothels, but their medical knowledge was limited to bloodletting, herbal potions, and prayers to various gods. Rome's version of healthcare was part superstition, part guesswork, and entirely inadequate. Like WebMD, but with more leeches and significantly less accuracy. When workers became seriously ill, they faced brutal economics, continue working while sick, or risk being thrown onto the streets to die. Plagues and epidemics regularly swept through crowded districts like the Subura, turning already terrible conditions into absolute nightmares. Anyone telling you ancient Rome was medically advanced hasn't looked at how they treated their most vulnerable populations. But here's the most shocking part. Despite all these obvious problems, the Roman government didn't just allow this system to continue. Forget what you think you know about Roman moral authority or governmental oversight. The truth is that the Roman Empire wasn't just tolerating brothels, they were active business partners in human exploitation. These establishments were regulated, licensed, and taxed exactly like any other Roman commercial enterprise. The same government that gave us legal systems and civic institutions also gave us industrial-scale forced servitude with official stamps of approval and detailed paperwork. Emperor Augustus, the man who supposedly cleaned up Roman morality and established lasting social reforms, kept brothels completely legal and operational. Even the guy trying to restore traditional values knew better than to mess with a profitable industry. The hypocrisy was staggering, but entirely typical of Roman pragmatism. Moral reform for thee, but not for me. Detailed restrictions existed specifically for workers under the Lex Julia and later imperial laws. Workers couldn't marry Roman citizens, couldn't hold public office, couldn't participate in religious ceremonies, and couldn't escape their legal classification. Rome created a permanent underclass with no path to redemption or respectability. Social mobility with a ceiling made of concrete and bureaucratic red tape. Municipal records meticulously track names, licenses, and locations of every worker. The government maintained detailed databases of human trafficking with the same precision they used for tax collection and military records. Big Brother, Roman style, except focused exclusively on human exploitation and significantly less subtle about it. Revenue from brothel taxes contributed significantly to city infrastructure and public works projects. Some emperors used profits from this brutal trade to fund gladiatorial games and public bathhouses. Religious institutions during the pagan era had absolutely no problem with state-sanctioned exploitation. The old gods weren't particularly concerned with moral standards, so there was zero religious pressure to change the system. This arrangement continued for centuries without any serious legal challenges or moral opposition. Frankly, even for an unvarnished historian like myself, it's remarkable how societies can normalize and profit from systematic cruelty when it's convenient and financially beneficial. The legacy of Roman brothels serves as a brutal reminder that technological and cultural progress doesn't automatically translate to human decency or moral advancement. Sometimes the most civilized societies are just better at organizing their barbarity. This is exactly the kind of brutal historical reality that gets sanitized in textbooks and Hollywood movies. But here's the thing. Roman brothels were just one example of how empires have always profited from human suffering. The Aztecs had their own twisted systems. Medieval Europe perfected different forms of exploitation. And don't even get me started on what Victorian England was hiding behind their moral superiority. If you're ready to keep peeling back the layers of historical lies and see what these so-called great civilizations were really built on, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more darkness to uncover, and I'm just getting started exposing the uncomfortable truths they don't want you to know. What other glorious empire should we investigate next?